In this video, we will look at the Shroud of Turin. Is it the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth, or a clever medieval forgery? My name is Michael D. Robertus. I'm a professor emeritus with the Department of Physics and Astronomy at York University. This talk was originally given to the Seniors Club with the St. Edward the Confessor Roman Catholic Church in Toronto in November 2024. I will admit straight off that I am not an expert in any of the relevant areas, the disparate areas that are required to really investigate and analyze the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin. I'm not an archaeologist, an historian, I'm not a chemist, I'm not a biologist, I'm not a medical expert, etc., etc. However, I have looked at much of the literature, particularly the published literature, and the reliable literature online. There's a lot of literature that is from very credulous literature that this has to be the burial cloth of Jesus, full stop, or the wish to debunk it, that it is not any kind of religious or Christian symbol for the faithful. So we're just going to look at the evidence and see where it takes us. Now, scripturally, I think many of us are aware that the shroud is mentioned in the Gospels, particularly Mark and Luke, speaking about wrapping Jesus up in fine linen or in a linen sheet, either here as depicted in medieval art at the foot of the cross, or perhaps even in the tomb that was donated for Jesus' body by Joseph of Arimathea. Now, in John's Gospel, it notes the linen cloths, that is in plural, including that which had been on his head. Now, this will become relevant at the very end of the talk. This is a very high contrast image of the shroud. You see here, split in two. This is the front image of what appears to be a crucified man, and this is the dorsal or rear image, which appears to be standing on his head. One can see a great deal of information, which we'll look at subsequently, but one can see these areas here, areas of trauma, of burning and of patching and water damage that over the centuries has occurred to the shroud. The shroud is made of linen and has been kept in a chapel of the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy since 1578. Here we see the chapel itself, the cathedral, and the piazza in front of it. This is looking up at the dome, very ornate and impressive structure of the chapel. Just to remind you that Turin is a city in northwest Italy, not very far from France, and its original appearance in history, as we shall see. The shroud is one of the most intensely studied artifacts in history, for obvious reasons. Now we're going to look at what the shroud looks like in normal lighting conditions. So here's the high contrast image of the front of the crucified man, and we'll look at what this rectangular box looks like in normal light. And one can see, well, you can make out that there apparently is sort of an image here, and if you're standing within about a couple of meters of the shroud, any closer and it wouldn't be apparent any further away, and who knows whether it would be that apparent. So that's how the shroud was known for the first few centuries. And in 1898, with the introduction of photography, an Italian photographer took an image of the shroud, and when developing the negative, saw this spectacular image. An image which appears to show a great amount of detail, some of which we'll look at, but one can see that there's a man with hair parted in the middle, wearing a crown of thorns, etc., etc., with a mustache and beard. A great amount of information can be derived from this, and clearly this image led to the rekindling of the interest of the shroud in the 20th and through the 21st centuries. Now let's look briefly at the history of the shroud. There was no mention in any historical record of the shroud before 1349. Within a few years, the French knight Geoffrey de Charny presented it to the dean of the church in Liry as Jesus' authentic burial shroud. And here is a picture of modern-day church at Liry. Liry is a small town near Troyes, France, in northeastern France, in the Champagne area. In 1389, the bishop of that area, Bishop Pierre d'Assy, claimed to know the artist who confessed to forging the shroud. Moreover, in some of the writing at the time, they knew it was a fake, but used it to raise money anyway. Now that seems like a very modern rationale. The Pope at the time, at least the anti-Pope Clement VII, declared it wasn't the true burial cloth of Jesus, but he allowed the church in Liry to continue to display it so long as it acknowledged that the cloth was cunningly painted and a religious icon, not an historic relic. So there's a difference between icon, which is the symbol of something, in this case holy, whereas the relic is the actual item. For example, the bone of the forearm of a saint or the cloth she wore, whereas an icon is a symbol like a statue of St. Joseph, for example. It's not St. Joseph, but in fact reminds us of St. Joseph. Now, the Catholic Church doesn't take an official position on the shroud's authenticity, claiming rightly it's a matter for scientific investigation, and all the modern popes, Pope Francis included, describe it as an icon rather than a relic. Now, why was this particularly important in the middle of the 14th and latter part of the 14th centuries? Well, because the Black Death re-emerged in France and throughout much of Europe, the bubonic plague. It decimated population centers in that century. And so to find something like a relic to ward off disease or an object of healing was very important to the people of the time. Now, this may suggest to some, particularly modern-day people, that this was an area of great credulity, of superstition, but not so fast. If one takes a look at really the psychology of what was going on at the time, it was incredibly traumatic, and they were not nearly as superstitious or credulous as one might believe. The shroud was acquired by the House of Savoy in 1453, and the House of Savoy was a royal kingdom established just after 1000 AD, or CE, as we sometimes refer to it now. The House of Savoy was a kingdom sort of in between where the southeast part of France and the northwest part of Italy currently reside. It moved to the new capital of Savoy, that is the Shroud, in 1578, and it has remained there ever since. We see a crest of the House of Savoy about this time, and clearly the shroud is prominently portrayed. The shroud now is in an environmentally controlled case, bulletproof glass, low light levels, low humidity, and in an environment of almost entirely argon gas with a little bit of nitrogen. It's only displayed on special occasions, 2015, 2010, and partly during COVID, and possibly again in 2025. Many copies of the shroud throughout the world. Now let's look at some of the details of the shroud. The shroud is about 14 or so feet long and 3.5 feet wide, or about 4.4 by 1.1 meters, which makes it, interestingly enough, almost exactly 8 by 2 cubits in dimensions, the cubit being a measure of distance in first century Palestine rather than, for example, medieval France. So we keep weighing the information. How probable is it to be a 14th century forgery or legitimately from the first century? It is made of linen. Jewish burial cloths stipulated they had to be made of linen. No cotton was permitted. It was a 3-to-1 herringbone weave, which I'm sure makes sense to some folks, but here's an example here. There are evidence, as we've seen, of burn holes, scorching from the fires, water damage, as well as some patching. I draw your attention to this area here, which will become important shortly. What does this image appear to show? Well, it shows and reveals a great deal of information. One can see apparently a straw yellow color of a man, both front and back images, with a beard, a mustache, shoulder-length hair parted in the middle. It's hard to gather his height because of possibly how the body was oriented in rigor mortis, for example, but between 5.5 and 6 feet is likely. And there are reddish-brown stains consistent with the wounds as described in the Gospels. For example, here you have blood, as you'll see, in the wrists and in the feet. One will see here in the right side of the man in the shroud, and yes, it's the right side. Recall that if you held your right side, put a cloth over you, and then pull the cloth up, it's a mirror image of what actually transpired in the body. And this wound apparently is indicative of something that very closely matches the dimensions of the spear tips in the first century Roman army. We'll look at that a little bit more later. So again, this shows a crucified man on his back, one half of the shroud, and the other half doubled over that covered the whole body. And again, it's consistent with a helmet-shaped crown of thorns. Not just a donut-shaped, but a helmet-shaped crown of thorns, which apparently has been archaeologically confirmed historically, that Romans, in fact, would use this type of crown, although perhaps not in the case of every crucifixion. There's a piercing on his right side, we've just discussed, nail marks on the wrists and the feet, and of course in the wrists is very interesting, since almost every Middle Age, Renaissance, and later painting has the nails through the palms rather than the wrists, and yet folks tell us in the know that a nail through the wrists would support the body much better than in the palms. And they're very interesting things that one can look at the references about the feet and where the feet were nailed through the sides and not through front way as is normally depicted. There's evidence of hundreds of scourge marks on the back and on the front of the body, bruises on the shoulder indicative of carrying a heavy load, and it's imagined, at least by many sources, historical sources, that Jesus likely carried a single beam of wood that was the horizontal component of the cross, the vertical beam being there already on Golgotha at the crucifixion site. The weight of the cross, the dense wood, would be about 75 to 125 pounds, according to some sources. There are also various blood stains that we'll take a look at momentarily. So were these markings transferred to the surface of the cloth when Christ's bloody corpse was laid against it, and so an icon and a relic? Interestingly enough, the shroud contains a lot of microscopic information, very compelling information, some would say. For example, if you take a tape and you put it on the shroud, take the tape off and analyze what one finds, we found a lot of pollen. And this pollen, some of it is native to Jerusalem and the nearby regions during the months of March and April, and especially from a plant here depicted that's likely yielded the thorns that were used to weave Christ's helmet, Christ's crown. Moreover, there is evidence for pollen from northern Syria, Turkey, Constantinople, and finally Europe, suggesting perhaps that if the shroud originated in the Middle East, it made its way via Syria, Turkey, Constantinople, and finally into medieval Europe, possibly a result of the Crusades, who knows. Moreover, there are fragments of dirt found near the feet, the knees, and even the nose of the man in the shroud, from a variety of limestone that is unique to the area around Jerusalem. This also provides interesting evidence. So, is it fake, a medieval forgery, or is it real? Not in the sense of does it exist, but in the sense of is this a first century burial cloth of Christ? Is it real or a forgery? Well, why would it be a forgery? To attract pilgrims and the coins in their pockets. Again, a very modern day attitude. So that's one possibility. Also, of course, we've looked at how it might be used to ward off disease, the Black Death. Now, science cannot prove that the shroud is the burial cloth of Jesus. That much is absolutely clear from the methodology of science. But it could prove it is a fake. And it could provide evidence consistent with being Jesus' burial cloth, and the more and more evidence we have, the more and more likely it could be. So let's begin with the age of the linen cloth. Now the linen comes from the flax plant, as depicted here. If the linen cloth proves to be much less than 2,000 years old, let's say several hundred years only, clearly it's a fake, a medieval forgery, which raises other questions, of course. But if it's around 2,000 years old, then deeper investigation is required. What we're never going to see, and this is a joke, we're going to see something like this, made in XXXIII. So we're going to look at dating the cloth, and the gold standard, as it were, of dating would be carbon dating. A couple of slides about carbon dating. All things, living things, from plants and animals, ingest carbon from the atmosphere while they're alive. Most of this carbon is of the form carbon-12, but some of this, a very little bit, is from radioactive carbon, carbon-14. Now, after plants or animals die, they do not ingest any more carbon-14 or carbon-12. The carbon-12 atoms are stable. They remain carbon-12 forever. But radioactive carbon atoms, carbon-14 atoms, decay to another element at a predictable rate. Here, by the way, is the carbon-12 nucleus. To those whom it makes sense, there are 6 protons and 6 neutrons. It's the 6 protons that give it the element carbon. Carbon-14 has 2 extra neutrons, and that leads to its radioactivity. If we were to take a sample, let's say a milligram or a microgram of a cloth, or a bone of an animal, and one measures how abundant the carbon-14 is at that moment to carbon-12 in that sample, one can get a very good sense of how long it has been since the animal died, or since the cloth in this context was made. Now let's imagine it's not the case, that there was an equal amount of carbon-14 and carbon-12 the moment the plant was woven into the shroud, and then this is what we measure today for the abundance of carbon-14 in that very little sample, tiny sample. We can then gather very precisely how many years it's been since the death of the animal or the making of the shroud. And this is, as I say, yields a very accurate age for the sample, providing there's no subsequent contamination, that is, since the creation or the death of the plant or the animal. In 1988, the Vatican gave postage stamp-sized pieces of the shroud to 3 labs for testing, 3 very reputable labs. And all 3 found that the linen was manufactured sometime between 1260 and 1390 with the uncertainties folded in. This clearly suggested a medieval forgery, but this was in contradiction or at odds with other dating techniques. Not precise techniques, but different techniques that all suggested that the shroud is a 1st century artifact. So if this is a discrepancy, then how do we explain it? There is substantial evidence, and those in the know will see this right away, that there has been patching after the fires. So we know that in the historical record, and the area in which the 3 postage stamp samples were taken seems, in retrospect, after further study, to be part of the area that was patched. So likely a rewoven area from the original cloth, where the poor Clares perhaps tried to make the shroud, look reasonable again after that fire in the 16th century. Moreover, it has been discovered that the patch or the area has a different chemical composition from the main part of the shroud and is truly anomalous. So either carbon contamination, and it contains cotton, so clearly it is a patch that was added subsequent to the creation of the shroud. Now there were other studies of the shroud, including before this carbon dating. In 1978, a team of leading experts was given permission to examine the shroud non-invasively, and they studied in great detail through looking at it, images of different radiations and elemental analysis and all kinds of things that I'm not entirely an expert on. And they found, or concluded that the shroud is that of a real human form, a scourged, crucified man with bloodstains, and it's not the product of an artist. So here, formally, they say it can't be any kind of something that was drawn onto the shroud. No pigments, no normal painting vehicles, no other outflows other than the blood has been added to the cloth since its creation or production. And the blood is real blood, possibly type AB, and it transferred from a wounded body rather than painted on. Let's look at some of the perplexing observations. How could they conclude some of this? We can take a look at all the other known burial cloths from antiquity. None has an image left on it, let alone an image with a crown of thorns or a helmet of thorns. We cannot reproduce the image on the shroud. We don't have any idea. That doesn't mean we won't one day, if it is a fake, find out how the person in the 14th century managed to fool everyone else for centuries. There is no known way at the moment. The image shows parts of the body that could not be in contact with the cloth, including from teeth and some bones. How does this work? And if you take a look at the actual image of the shroud microscopically, each of the linen threads, which is about 1 millimeter in diameter, is composed of hundreds of fibrils. Each fibril is much, much less than the width of a human hair, and the image on the shroud is only found on one fibril, the outer fibril, one fibril deep, so it's not seeped into the thread at all, let alone to the depth of the shroud. So any chemical application would leave much more intrusive chemical residue. So this is already highly perplexing. Now, the blood appears to be red, and it's in relatively the right spot, as it were, on the crown of thorns, the wrist, side, and on the feet. Blood ages, it turns brown, right? So this clearly is evidence for a forgery. But it turns out that blood from a person under great stress or undergoing great suffering contains bilirubin, and this causes a permanent red color to the blood, over centuries even. Again, see, the blood locations matches the wounds described in Scripture. Some anatomical details seem out of proportion. Some suggest that this is consistent with rigor mortis. That's why we couldn't say how tall Jesus really was. If this is the burial shroud, let's say the man in the shroud more properly. So here is the front image of the shroud in a negative form. And a forensic expert very recently from Brazil indicated that, the 3D shroud would yield an awkward 2D image if it were wrapped around Christ's body. You'd see something that looks like this if it was the surface that was imprinted on the shroud, where it was in contact with the body, whereas he suggested it's more realistic. This was almost a bas-relief tracing, like some people do medieval tracings in Europe. We have a few in our house, in fact. There are some questions still outstanding. Now, in 2022, an Italian lab used another technique to date the shroud. They used X-rays to measure the degradation of the thread. So what does that mean? It means that as the shroud ages, the cellulose, the threads will degrade. They will degrade. Age, humidity, temperature, for example, are the variables. So if one could compare the shroud's threads with linen garments taken in antiquity, that is, the threads that could be very well dated, such as garments from the siege of Masada, which took place about 70 AD, again in the 1st century, one could make a comparison and make a statement about the authenticity of the shroud, at least in terms of its date of origin. Masada, a very, very interesting story, as you know, during the Jewish-Roman War about 70 AD, where led to the decimation and destruction of Jerusalem and the temple and the slaughter of over 1 million Jews. Some Jews escaped to Masada, tens of kilometers south of Jerusalem, and you could look up the history of that event, the traumatic event. It makes very interesting video presentations. Anyway, this group found an age consistent with 2,000 years for the shroud. Moreover, if the shroud were made in the 14th century, that is, were a forgery constructed in the 14th century, for it to look as it does now, the level of degradation, it would have had to be stored at extremely high temperatures for the past 7 centuries, at 30 to 40 degrees Celsius, which clearly is not the case. Moreover, it's interesting that had it been in the Middle East for the last 2,000 years and not brought to Central Europe, the shroud itself would have yellowed and making any pattern invisible today. Very speculatively, we know no foreign substance on the cloth can account for the image. So how was it produced? Some folks suggest that at the moment of the resurrection, a sudden burst of energy would explain something like a 3D image and why non-surface features such as teeth and bones are evident on the image of the shroud. The resurrection, being a supernatural event, is not an object of science by definition. So scientists can't really say anything about that, and you can speculate all you want, but Ray Rogers, one of the members of the 1978 STURP committee studying the shroud and who studied the shroud throughout his life until his death, seems to suggest that any high temperature heating event or burst of X-rays or whatever would have catastrophic consequences for the linen of the shroud. And it makes sense, but I'm no expert in this area. Does it really matter whether the shroud is the actual burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth? This is more speculation. Some folks would say, yes, something like this, like the discovery of Noah's Ark, for example, would lead unbelievers to a belief in Jesus Christ or a belief in God at least. And minimally, it would increase the faith of believers. But is that really the case? If one looks at it, is it really a question of faith? No. Faith is a complex issue that requires both the intellect and the will, a trust, but also an assent by the intellect. Veneration of icons is permitted in Catholicism. Catholics believe that icons are a reminder of God's love and invite us to contemplate the holy figures they depict and the greater mystery underlying it. Being a forgery would not lead to any loss of faith, or should not lead to any loss of faith, but it can provide the stimulation or motivation for a deeper investigation or reflection on our faith. And as we conclude the talk, we look at possibly even more coincidences or evidence for the shroud. On the left here, we have an image from the Hungarian Prey Codex. So the codex being a manuscript and Prey being named after the person who discovered it. This was in existence a century or more before the shroud first enters history. And it appears to show, at least here, a burial cloth of Jesus with a weave, a 3-to-1 weave that apparently was not common in medieval France, but was in the first century Middle East. And it has an L-shaped burn marks here, which apparently compare faithfully to the actual shroud itself. So was this an indication that the shroud was known centuries before it was first mentioned in 1349? And then we have this linen piece here, the Sudarium Oviedo. So this is a cloth, possibly the face cloth mentioned in John's Gospel. It has been known since the 6th century, possibly even earlier, so was not a medieval forgery. And if you can compare the blood stains, location, and profuseness of this compared to the shroud, they match apparently very well at the face and forehead of Jesus. Now, I take the discoverers and the folks who made the comparisons word about it, but these are very interesting, possibly pieces of evidence. And so we have 3D information about the man or person in the shroud, and we have AI. So let AI loose and generate an image of the person in the shroud, and one such generated image is shown here. Here is, of course, the negative image of the face of the person in the shroud, and here is a sort of equivalent AI depiction of what this person would look like. Might this be an image of Jesus of Nazareth? Well, Who knows? Science will never be able to say for sure, but it's intriguing to explore what secrets the Shroud perhaps still has for science and has for faith. Thank you very much.